The church doors groaned on their hinges as Sheriff Kane pushed them open, the sound like a coffin lid dragged against stone. The congregation turned as one, their whispers swallowed by the sudden silence that followed him in. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight, slanting through cracked, stained glass, turning the air into something holy, fragile, like the town itself. Kane's boots struck the warped floorboards, each step loud in the stillness. He removed his black hat, slowly, holding it at his side. His steel-gray eyes swept the pews, reading the fear, the doubt, and the unease that clung to every face. He had not come here for prayer. He had come because justice, his kind of justice, had a way of leaving ghosts, and sometimes a man needed to look God in the eye and ask whether the badge on his chest meant anything at all. Above the altar, the wooden cross hung heavy against the stone wall. Its shadow stretched across Kane's figure as he approached the front pew. His scar caught the light, a pale slash running from jaw to neck, like a reminder of all the years violence had carved into him. And then it happened. The cross shuddered. A single nail squealed, echoing through the vaulted room. Heads turned upward, eyes wide. With a groan of wood and iron, the cross tore loose from its moorings and came crashing down. It struck the altar, splitting candles and scattering flame across the floor. Sparks hissed. Wax spilled like blood. The wooden beams slammed onto the floorboards with a thunderous crack, inches from Kane's boots. Gasps filled the church. A woman screamed. Kane stood motionless, eyes locked on the fallen cross. The flames licked around it, casting twisted shadows on the walls. For a moment, it seemed less a house of God and more a battlefield, the pews like trenches, the air thick with smoke and judgment. Reverend Hollis clutched his Bible to his chest, his face pale as parchment. "It's a sign," he whispered, though the word carried clearly in the silence. "A sign from heaven." All eyes turned to Kane. He bent down slowly, the leather of his duster creaking, and touched the splintered beam. It was warm, the heat from the flames crawling into his palm. His silver badge glinted as he leaned forward, catching the light of the fire. For an instant, it seemed as if the badge and the cross were bound together in one glow, a reminder, or perhaps a warning. Kane lifted his gaze, meeting the eyes of the congregation. They did not look at him as they once had, not with respect, not even with fear, something deeper now, a suspicion that he had brought this omen down upon them by the weight of his sins. A man's voice cut through the murmurs. The sheriff's cursed. It was old Brewer, a rancher whose son Kane had jailed last month for rustling. Gods turned his face away from him. Kane's jaw tightened. His hand drifted to the pearl-handled Colt on his hip. Not to draw, but to remind them all he was still the law in this town, still the man who kept the wolves from their door, even if they hated the way he did it. The Reverend raised his hand. "Peace," he called, though his voice shook. "Peace, my flock. Accidents happen." But his eyes betrayed him. He didn't believe it was an accident. Kane replaced his hat on his head, his face unreadable. "Accidents happen," he repeated, his voice low, steady, but carrying through the church like rolling thunder. "But justice still stands." He turned, walking back down the aisle, each step echoing louder than the last. The townsfolk shrank from him, pressing into the pews as though his shadow might burn them. A child whimpered. A mother hushed him quickly, as if afraid Kane would hear. Outside, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. The wind dragged grit across the street, rattling the saloon shutters and setting the gallows rope to swaying. Kane stepped onto the church porch, his boots crunching the gravel. Behind him, the church door creaked shut, leaving the murmurs of fear trapped inside. He paused, staring at the silver badge pinned to his chest. His fingers spun it slowly, the way he always did when the world pressed too hard on him. The badge caught the dying sunlight, flashing like a blade. From the saloon across the street, Marshal Dillard watched. He leaned against the rail, a cigar smoldering in his hand, his black coat polished, his badge shining brighter than it had a right to. His smile was thin, smug, the kind of smile a man wore when he'd been waiting for another man to stumble and finally saw it happen. The marshal stepped down into the street, his spurs jangling. "Heard the sermon?" he said as he approached. "Heard the cross fell right at your feet. Folks are saying it wasn't just wood that broke loose. It was the Lord's patience." Kane's eyes narrowed, unreadable steel. Dillard puffed smoke into the air, savoring the moment. "This town doesn't need omens, Kane. It needs law. Real law. Not your kind of half-law, half-blood vengeance." He tapped his own badge. Some of us still remember what it stands for. The wind shifted, carrying the clang of the gallows chain. Kane said nothing. His silence was a weapon sharper than any word. But Dillard wasn't finished. He leaned close, lowering his voice so only Kane could hear. "You're finished here. One more slip, one more crack in that cold armor of yours, and the town'll beg me to take your badge. Maybe even your neck." Kane's eyes didn't flicker. His hand hovered near his Colt, not touching, but close enough to remind the marshal of the line between words and gunfire. Dillard chuckled, stepping back. "Careful, Sheriff. Don't let the devil whisper in your ear while you're standing in God's house." The marshal turned, striding toward the saloon, his laughter low and bitter. Kane watched him go, his face carved from stone. Behind him, the church bell began to toll, though no hand pulled the rope. The sound rolled across the town, mournful and heavy, as if it too was tolling judgment. Kane stood alone in the street, the fallen cross burning in his mind. He knew what the town was thinking, what the marshal was plotting, and he knew the storm was only beginning. A storm that would break, not just the town, but the fragile line between his badge and his soul. The wind carried dust across the street, whipping around his duster, stinging his scar. He pulled his hat low, eyes narrowing against the gust, and started toward the jailhouse. The bell kept tolling, louder now, though the church stood empty, and Sheriff Kane did not look back. The sun bled out behind the hills, leaving Perdition Hollow wrapped in copper twilight. The bell in the church had finally fallen silent, though no one could explain how it had tolled so long without a hand pulling the rope. Folks said maybe the wind had caught it, but Kane knew better. The wind didn't toll bells that steady. As Sheriff Kane walked down Main Street, his boots grinding into the dirt, the town seemed to shrink from him. He could feel it in the way doors closed a heartbeat too quick, in the way faces turned away when his steel-gray eyes passed over them. It was the same town he had bled for, fought for, buried friends in, and yet tonight, it was no longer his. At the corner near the well, two women whispered, their hands clutched at their shawls like armor. One dared a glance at Kane, then muttered to the other, "The cross fell 'cause of him. Man carries too many ghosts. God's done, turned his back." A boy, no older than 12, scurried across the street, nearly dropping his sack of flour. When Kane reached to steady him, the child jerked away, like he'd touched fire. His mother appeared, dragging the boy close. Her eyes flicked up, but she couldn't hold Kane's gaze. "Best keep to yourself, Sheriff," she muttered, then pulled her son along without waiting for a reply. Kane stopped in the center of the street, the setting sun painting his shadow long across the dust. His hand went to his badge, spinning it slow. The silver caught the fading light, but it felt heavier tonight, as if even the metal was beginning to question whether it belonged on his chest. From the saloon came the twang of a piano, clumsy but loud, played to drown out the tension hanging in the town. Laughter followed, brittle and forced. He pushed through the batwing doors, and conversation dropped like a stone. The smell of whiskey and smoke clung to the air. Old Brewer sat at a table with 3 ranch hands, his words slurred but pointed. "Tell me God didn't mean something dropping that cross," fell right at Kane's feet like judgment from the sky. "Lawman's cursed, I tell ya." One of the ranch hands chuckled nervously. "Careful, Brewer, he's standing right behind you." Brewer turned, his cheeks flushed with whiskey and boldness, his eyes fixed on Kane, defiant. "You bring death wherever you go, Sheriff. Folks remember. Blood on the jailhouse floor when you gunned down Clem Tooley. Blood on the gallows when you strung up that boy without letting his mama say goodbye. You call it justice, but I call it curses." The piano player's hands froze above the keys. All eyes swung to Kane. Kane stepped closer, boots thudding slow, deliberate. His shadow fell across Brewer's table. "Law ain't always justice," he said, his voice low, the words heavy as stone. "But justice rides with me." The saloon was silent enough to hear the creak of leather when Kane shifted his coat. His Colt .45 gleamed at his hip, pearl handle pale in the lamplight. Brewer swallowed, his courage leaking out through his eyes. Kane let the silence linger, then turned and walked to the bar. The barkeep, a thin man with a balding scalp, poured a shot without being asked. His hand trembled, sloshing whiskey onto the counter. "On the house, Sheriff," he muttered. Kane tossed the drink back in one swallow, the burn settling in his chest. He set the glass down, turned, and found Marshal Dillard leaning against the far wall, cigar glowing like a devil's eye. Dillard stepped forward, boots polished, spurs jingling. His badge caught the lamplight as though it were brighter, cleaner, more righteous than Kane's tarnished silver. "Town's restless," he said, voice smooth as oil, whispers running quicker than wildfire in dry grass. Folks starting to wonder if the sheriff they trusted ain't just another outlaw with a badge. Kane said nothing, only spun his badge between thumb and forefinger. The marshal's smile widened. "I hear talk, Kane. Talk of men who say you've gone too far, hanging a boy without trial, gunning down drifters before they drew, even burying evidence when it suited you. That cross fallen today, that was Providence reminding us some men hide behind law, but God still keeps the ledger." Brewer muttered agreement, emboldened by Dillard's words. "Damn right. Kane's brought us nothing but graves." The room buzzed with nods, whispers, shifting boots. Kane's silence fed their fear more than any words could. Then a voice broke through, trembling but fierce. Eliza Merrick, the widow in black, rose from her corner table. She was slight, her eyes hollowed by loss, but her voice cut through the smoke. "And who'll keep the ledger on Marshal Dillard?" The room turned to her. She held her shawl close, but her chin lifted with stubborn defiance. "My husband was a rancher. worked his land honest. One night, men came with torches, said the Marshal had claim to our water rights. Next morning, my husband was found dead in that same creek. Dillard called it bandits, but I know better. My husband stood in the way of his gold. Gasps rippled through the saloon. Dillard's smile froze. His cigar trembled just enough for Kane to notice. "You watch your tongue, widow," Dillard said, his voice sharper now, venom beneath the honey. But Eliza pressed on, tears brimming in her eyes. "I kept the papers he signed, the contracts your men forged. You think the Lord don't see, Marshal? Maybe that cross didn't fall for Kane at all. Maybe it fell for you." The saloon roared with divided voices. Some shouted for Eliza to hush. Others muttered that they always suspected Dillard's land deals stank of blood. Kane's gaze never left the Marshal's face. Dillard regained his composure with a slow drag on his cigar. "Widows are prone to stories. Grief makes liars of us all. But this town's had enough of violence. Sheriff Kane's time is done." He pointed at Kane with the glowing end of his cigar, like a preacher condemning sin. "Soon there'll be a reckoning." Kane's jaw flexed, but he stayed silent. He knew the trap being laid. The Marshal wanted him to draw, to give the town proof that the omen in the church meant the sheriff had turned devil. Instead, Kane turned to Eliza. "Bring me those papers," he said, his voice steady. "If you've got proof, it don't belong buried in your house. It belongs where the light can burn it clean." The room hushed. Even Dillard blinked, surprised at Kane's restraint. Eliza's lip trembled, but she nodded. "Tomorrow, meet me at the abandoned courthouse, the only place left in this town where truth might still echo." Dillard flicked his cigar to the floor, grinding it under his boot heel. His smile returned, cold as winter steel. "Be careful, Kane. Truth can get a man killed quicker than any bullet." Kane adjusted his hat, steel eyes locked on the Marshal. So can lies. He pushed through the batwing doors and out into the night. Behind him, the saloon erupted in whispers, louder than before, voices spilling into the street. Betrayal traveled fast. The wind carried the sound of the gallows rope, creaking in the darkness, swinging though no one touched it. Sheriff Kane stood alone beneath the stars, the fallen cross still burning in his mind, and knew tomorrow would drag him into the courthouse, where law and justice would finally tear at each other's throat. The dawn broke over Perdition Hollow like a blade drawn slow across the sky. Red light bled into the clouds, washing the streets in a copper glow. To Sheriff Kane, it felt less like sunrise and more like a wound opening. He sat outside the jailhouse, hat low, rolling tobacco between his fingers. Smoke curled from his lips in thin threads, disappearing into the cool morning air. His silver badge spun in his other hand, glinting dully, as though it too had grown weary of the fight. The town stirred restless. Doors opened early, shutters clapped shut, and whispers spread faster than the morning wind. Women fetching water from the well spoke in hushed tones about the fallen cross. Cowboys at the hitching post muttered that the sheriff's soul had finally come due. The sound carried, every word digging like grit under Kane's skin. Then came the sound of hooves. 4 riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes sharp against the bleeding dawn. At their center rode Marshal Dillard. His coat was pressed, his boots polished, his badge gleamed like a mirror catching fire. He carried himself with the ease of a man who believed the town was already his. Behind him, 3 deputies rode stiff-backed, rifles slung casual but ready. The riders slowed as they entered Main Street, the townsfolk stepping aside, creating a path as though for a funeral procession. The piano in the saloon stopped mid-note. By the time Dillard reined up before the jailhouse, the whole town had gone quiet. Kane didn't move. He blew smoke, his eyes steel-gray and unblinking. "Well now," Dillard said, swinging off his horse with the grace of a man born for stages. "Sheriff Kane, still holding court in your fortress of silence." He brushed dust from his coat sleeve, though none clung to it. His voice carried like a sermon. "I come under orders from the territorial governor himself. This town's law has grown crooked, and crooked law don't stand long." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kane flicked his cigarette into the dirt, crushing it under his boot. "Say what you came to say." Dillard's smile widened. He gestured to the church steeple, the morning light glinting off its cracked bell. "You were there yesterday when the cross fell. The people saw it. A sign from heaven that Perdition Hollow deserves better. A sheriff who lives by the law, not one who writes his own gospel in blood." Old Brewer shouted from the crowd, his voice thick with whiskey even this early. "That's right. Kane's brought us curses. God sent the sign, and Marshal Dillard heard it clear." The marshal let the words hang, feeding the crowd's unease. His deputies dismounted, spreading out with deliberate slowness, rifles gleaming. Dillard turned back to Kane, his voice lowering, oily and sharp. "The governor's writ gives me authority here. I'll be reviewing your records, your arrests, your hangings. Any man who hanged a boy without trial, any lawman who shot before the draw. Such a man's no better than an outlaw, and an outlaw's got no right to wear a badge." Kane stood, tall and broad-shouldered, dust-worn duster falling heavy against his frame. His scar caught the sun like pale lightning. He let the silence stretch before answering. "Law ain't always justice," he said, voice like gravel dragged across steel, "but justice rides with me." The words carried, heavy as thunder. Some faces in the crowd nodded faintly. Ranchers who remembered Kane driving out bandits, mothers who remembered him burying a child's killer. But others shook their heads, fear swallowing memory. Dillard chuckled. "Fine words, Sheriff. But the law doesn't ride with ghosts. It rides with writs, with signatures, with order. And that badge," he pointed to Kane's chest, "belongs to the people, not to your conscience." At that moment, the widow Eliza Merrick stepped into the street, her black shawl pulled tight, a bundle of papers clutched to her chest. Her voice rang clear. "And who keeps the law when the marshal is the outlaw?" All eyes turned. Dillard's smile faltered. Eliza held up the papers. "My husband signed contracts that bled him dry. Forged by your men, Marshal. Stolen land, stolen water. He stood against you, and next morning he was dead in that very creek." Her voice trembled, but she did not lower it. "God saw the cross fall, yes, but maybe it fell at Kane's feet, because this town has forgotten what true justice is." The crowd stirred like dry grass in a windstorm. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered that they'd always suspected Dillard's gold came from graves. Dillard's deputies stiffened, hands inching toward their rifles. The marshal's voice turned cold as iron. "Widow's grief breeds lies. Careful, Eliza. Words like those can dig your grave." Kane stepped forward, his coat brushing the dirt. "She ain't lying." His voice cut like a blade. "And if she's got proof, it belongs where the law still echoes." His eyes narrowed. The old courthouse. Tomorrow. Gasps spread. The courthouse had stood abandoned for years, a hollow shell where verdicts once thundered and justice once mattered. To invoke it was to summon ghosts. Dillard's jaw tightened. He masked it with a smile, but his cigar trembled between his fingers. Very well, we'll meet there. But mark me, Kane, the law will decide, and when it does, you'll find yourself stripped of that badge and maybe your neck in a noose. Kane's steel eyes didn't blink. I've worn worse. For a moment, the two men faced each other in the street. Lawman against lawman, badges gleaming in the red dawn. The town held its breath. Then Dillard turned, swinging into his saddle with practiced ease. His deputies followed, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the stone. He looked back once, his smile cold as a coffin lid. Tomorrow, Sheriff, the courthouse will choose between us. As the riders disappeared into the rising sun, whispers erupted like gunfire through the crowd. Some said Kane was finished. Others swore Dillard's mask was cracking. Kane stood alone in the street, the wind tugging at his duster. The gallows rope, creaking in the distance like it, too, waited for a verdict. He spun his badge once more, the silver flashing like a star gone dim, and he knew tomorrow's trial would not be decided by law or God. It would be decided by blood. The abandoned courthouse stood like a tomb at the edge of Perdition Hollow. Its shutters hung loose, banging against cracked windows with every gust of morning wind. Weeds split the stone steps, and the gavel still lay where it had fallen years ago, half buried in dust. Once, verdicts thundered in this place. Now it whispered only with ghosts. Sheriff Kane climbed those steps slow, each bootfall echoing in the hollow silence. His duster whipped in the wind, and his silver badge spun between his fingers. The air smelled of old paper, mildew, and judgment, left to rot. Inside, the pews were broken, the judge's bench cracked, and shafts of pale light spilled through holes in the roof. The town had gathered despite their fear. Farmers, ranch wives, saloon men. They packed the aisles, whispering like jurors before the verdict. Their eyes flicked between Kane and Marshal Dillard, who stood at the far end of the hall, polished boots gleaming, deputies flanking him like shadows. Eliza Merrick stepped forward from the crowd. Her black shawl was pulled tight against her shoulders, her face pale but resolute. She clutched a bundle of papers, edges worn, ink faded. Her hands trembled as she faced the gathering, yet her voice carried with the weight of a confession meant to pierce heaven itself. "My husband, John Merrick," she began, eyes fixed on the rafters as though she needed God himself to hear. He was no outlaw. He was a rancher, honest and steady, but he stood on land Marshal Dillard wanted, land with water running deep, richer than gold in these parts. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dillard's jaw tightened, though his smile stayed painted on like cheap paint. Eliza lifted the first sheet, her voice growing steadier. These contracts bear his name, but not his hand. Forged. Witnesses bought or buried. Dillard claimed my husband owed debt, and when John refused to bend, the marshal's men came with torches. By dawn, my husband lay face down in the creek, and Dillard called it bandits. Her words cracked like a whip. The crowd stirred, some gasping, some crossing themselves. Kane stood unmoving, steel eyes fixed on the marshal. He'd seen widows before, broken and hollow, but Eliza was different, her grief sharpened into a blade. Dillard stepped forward, his voice smooth, meant for sermons. A widow's grief makes stories. Contracts don't lie. That land was seized by lawful means. Eliza's voice rose, breaking over him. Lawful? You signed his death with that badge on your chest. And I watched the fire burn my barn. I heard the laughter of your men as they rode off. My husband's body washed up downstream with bullet holes in his back. Not the work of bandits, but of men paid to erase him. The hall went silent. Dust motes drifted through the light like snow over graves. Kane spoke then, his voice low, heavy. Show the papers. Eliza walked to the bench, placing the bundle on the cracked wood where once judges ruled. Kane flipped through them, his scar catching the light as he read. Forged signatures, overlapping ink, dates that did not align. Enough to hang a man twice over if justice still breathed in this town. The Marshal's deputies shifted, unease flickering in their eyes. Dillard's mask slipped for the briefest second, his smile curdling into something sharp, predatory. He recovered quick, spreading his arms. Even if these papers were true, they prove nothing of murder. Land disputes don't hang a lawman. Kane lifted his gaze, voice like iron dragged across stone. No, but lies do. And you've wrapped yourself in enough of them to choke this whole town. A murmur swelled into shouts, half the crowd calling for Dillard's arrest, the other half warning Kane that the Marshal had the governor's ear. Fear mingled with fury until the courthouse seemed ready to split apart. That's when Eliza's voice cut through, trembling but unyielding. There's more. The hall hushed. All eyes swung back to her. She reached inside her shawl, pulling out a folded letter, the paper stained with water, and something darker. Her hands shook as she held it out. My husband left me this the night before he died. Said if anything happened, it would be because of Marshal Dillard. Said the Marshal had threatened him plain. Kane took the letter, unfolded it slow. The ink was smudged, but the words cut deep. If I die, it will be by the hand of Dillard. He covets my land, and he will kill me for it. Gasps filled the hall. A ranch wife sobbed. Men muttered curses under their breath. Kane raised the letter high for all to see. The dead speak clearer than the living. John Merrick's blood stains this badge of yours, Marshal. Dillard's face hardened. He stepped closer, voice lowering to a hiss only Kane and Eliza could hear. Careful, Sheriff. You think a widow's words and smudged ink will stand against the governor's seal? I'll bury you both before sundown. Kane's hand hovered near his colt, his scar tightening with the pull of old rage. But he held, letting the silence choke Dillard's threat. Eliza turned to the crowd, her eyes wet but burning. You all know me. You knew John. He was no liar. He wanted nothing but to raise cattle and keep peace. And now I stand with the only man willing to face this Marshal's lies. If you abandon Kane now, you abandon justice itself. The hall thundered with divided voices. Some shouted to trust the sheriff. Others cried that no man could stand against the governor's will. Fear and courage clashed until the courthouse walls shook with it. And then the old bell above the courthouse tolled once, though no rope was pulled, the sound deep and hollow as judgment. It rolled over the crowd, freezing them in place. Dillard smiled thin again, eyes glinting like a blade in the dark. Let the people speak tomorrow, Kane. They'll choose law or your so-called justice, and when they choose me, you'll be stripped of that badge before your God and theirs. He turned sharply, his deputies following, boots pounding against the old wood. The crowd parted like water, whispers trailing after him. Eliza clutched her shawl tighter, her shoulders trembling now that her words were spent. Kane stepped to her side, his hand steady on her arm. She looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Did I damn us both?" Kane shook his head once, his jaw set hard. "You told the truth. Truth's the only bullet that never misses. Question is, who it kills first." He helped her down from the bench, the papers gathered in his fist. Around them the townsfolk whispered, fear still thick, but hope flickering like candlelight. Outside, the sky darkened, though the sun had not yet set. Storm clouds boiled over the horizon, the kind that split earth and bone alike. Kane stepped into the gathering wind, his badge flashing as lightning forked across the sky. He knew the storm was no longer just in heaven. It was here, in Perdition Hollow, waiting for his next move. And somewhere deep inside him, the scar on his jaw burned, as if warning that tomorrow's verdict would carve a new wound, one no man could heal. The storm arrived before the trial. Thunder rolled over Perdition Hollow, rattling loose boards and echoing down the valley like cannon fire. Rain hammered the dirt streets into rivers of mud. Lightning flared against the black sky, throwing the old courthouse into silhouette. Its windows were lit from within, a beacon for the crowd that pressed inside, desperate to see which man would carry the law when dawn came. Sheriff Kane entered through the wide double doors, water a-dripping from his duster. He carried no umbrella, no protection, but the Colt on his hip, and the badge spinning in his fingers. His eyes swept the room, faces damp from rain, eyes sharp with suspicion. Half these townsfolk had once cheered his name. Tonight, they looked at him as though weighing rope against mercy. At the far end, Marshal Dillard stood tall behind the cracked judge's bench. His coat was dry, his boots polished. Deputies flanked him like sentinels, rifles glinting in the lamplight. He smiled at Kane with the calm of a man who believed the gallows already built. Reverend Hollis sat stiff in the front pew, Bible trembling in his hands. Beside him, Eliza Merrick clutched her shawl, her papers resting in her lap like weapons sharper than steel. The thunder shook the rafters. Dillard raised his hands, his voice carrying over the storm. "People of Perdition Hollow, we gather here in the name of law. A sign has been given. The cross fell at this sheriff's feet, proof that God himself demands change. Tonight I place Sheriff Kane on trial for crimes against the law he swore to uphold." Gasps filled the room. Kane did not flinch. He walked slow to the center aisle, the boards groaning beneath his boots. His voice was low, steady, but every ear strained to catch it. "You speak of signs, Marshal, but God ain't the one writing your contracts in blood. Widow Merrick's husband died for refusing to sell his land. You call that law. I call it murder, hiding behind a badge." A murmur rippled through the hall. Dillard's eyes flashed, but he masked it with a smile. Lies of a grieving widow. Nothing more. Eliza rose, her voice cutting sharp through the storm. Lies. These papers prove the forgeries, and this letter. She held it high. My husband's own hand. He named you Marshal the night before he died. The crowd surged with whispers. Kane took the letter, holding it aloft. This courthouse once echoed with truth. Let it echo again. He placed the paper on the bench before Dillard. Dillard leaned close enough only Kane could hear. You think old ink will save you. The governor's seal is stronger than any widow's tears. His smile was all teeth. Kane's steel eyes didn't waver. Seal or no seal, the ground remembers blood. The Reverend rose, his voice quivering but loud. Order! Let us hear the sheriff's defense. Kane turned to the people, his scar catching the lamplight like a pale brand. I've killed, yes. I've hung men who deserved it, and some who maybe didn't. The law ain't clean, but I never stole a man's land with forged ink, never burned his barn, never left his widow with nothing but ashes. Dillard wears his badge like armor, but behind it, he's a thief and a killer. The words struck like hammers. Some men nodded, anger sparking in their eyes. Others shook their heads, afraid to defy the Marshal. Dillard raised a hand, his voice sharp. Sheriff Kane admits his crimes. He says himself he spilled blood outside the law. He's no better than the outlaws he claims to hunt. Kane's jaw tightened. Sometimes law is just rope in the wrong hands. Justice. He tapped his chest where the badge lay heavy. Justice rides in here, and it's time this town chose which it wants. Lightning split the roof with white fire. For a moment the courthouse glowed like Judgment Day itself. Dillard slammed his fist on the bench. Enough. This trial ain't about me. It's about him. Do you want a sheriff cursed by God, or a marshal who'll bring order? The room boiled with voices, shouting, crying, accusing. The storm outside battered the windows like fists on a coffin lid. Then Eliza's voice rose above the chaos. This is about truth. My husband's blood calls from the ground. Will you let it be silenced, or will you listen? The hall froze. All eyes swung to the widow, trembling but unbroken. The papers shook in her hand. Dillard's face hardened. He stepped around the bench, his boots echoing like gunshots. His hand rested on his pistol. One more word, widow, and I'll silence you myself. Gasps rippled. Deputies shifted, uncertain. Kane stepped forward, placing himself between Eliza and the Marshal. His Colt hung loose at his side, not drawn but ready, his steel eyes locked on Dillard's. You draw in this courthouse, Marshal, and it won't be the widow who falls. For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to hold its breath. The creak of the gallows rope carried faintly through the rain. Dillard's smile returned, thin as a blade. Careful, Kane. If you cross me now, you're not just defying me. You're defying the governor himself. One word from me, and they'll brand you outlaw before sundown. Kane's voice was iron. Outlaw or sheriff, it don't matter. I'll still be the man who stands between you and every soul you'd bleed dry. The silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. The townsfolk stared, waiting for the spark that would set fire to it all. The Reverend clutched his Bible tighter. God help us, he whispered, and then lightning struck so close the building shook. The lamps guttered. Shadows leapt wild across the walls. In the darkness, a single pistol cocked, the sound sharp as a death knell. No one could tell whose hand had moved first. The gunshots split the courthouse like a thunderclap. Glass shattered, benches overturned, and the crowd scattered in panic. The lamps swayed. Shadows lunged across the cracked walls, and in that chaos, Marshal Dillard's voice rose like a whip. "Seize him! Sheriff Kane's under arrest!" Rifles snapped up. Kane moved before the echo faded. He shoved Eliza behind the bench and drew his Colt, pearl handle flashing in the guttering lamplight. His shot rang out, sending one of Dillard's deputies crashing across the pews. Screams followed, boots pounding as townsfolk fled into the storm outside. Kane ducked low, bullets splintering wood around him. The smell of gunpowder mixed with mildew, thick and choking. He rolled across the floorboards, came up firing, and dropped another deputy in the chaos. His badge gleamed in the stormlight, breaking through shattered windows, as if to remind the crowd that this was not outlaw work. This was the law, fighting for its own life. But Dillard had the numbers. His men pressed forward, muzzles spitting flame, forcing Kane toward the doors. He fired until his Colt clicked empty, then hurled himself through the broken doors into the hammering rain. Lightning lit the street white. Thunder drowned the screams. He staggered across the mud, boots slipping, heart pounding. The townsfolk scattered into alleys, desperate to escape the crossfire. Kane reloaded as he moved, shells clinking against the soaked boards of the porch. Behind him, Dillard shouted orders, his voice iron. Drive him to the church. Pin the bastard where he belongs. The words cut through the storm, and Kane's blood chilled. The church, the place where the cross had fallen. The Marshal wanted him cornered beneath that broken altar, a showpiece to prove the sheriff had been struck down by God and man alike. Kane didn't run from it. He turned toward the church, pushing through the rain until its steeple rose above him, black against the lightning sky. The doors banged open under his hand, and he stumbled inside, dripping rainwater onto the warped boards. The sanctuary was dark, save for the glow of half-burned candles. The fallen cross still lay across the floor, charred from the night before. Its shadow stretched long, jagged, like a wound across the pews. Kane stood in that shadow, breathing hard, Colt raised, waiting. The doors burst wide. Dillard strode in, his coat dry under the slicker he'd worn, his badge gleaming. 6 deputies fanned out behind him, rifles steady, boots echoing off the stone walls. Candlelight flickered across their faces, making them look less like men and more like executioners. Dillard's smile was calm, confident. You couldn't have picked a finer place to die, Sheriff. Right where the Lord showed us his judgment. Kane's eyes narrowed, steel gray, cold. The Lord don't write contracts in blood and fire barns to ash. That's your hand, Marshal. Dillard laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters. You think anyone cares what a widow says, or what a cursed sheriff mutters in the dark? When the governor hears of this, it'll be simple. You drew first, you killed deputies, you turned outlaw, and I... He tapped his badge. I restored order. Lightning flared through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in blood red and gold. Kane raised his Colt. Then let order be tested. The church exploded with gunfire. Muzzles flashed like lightning inside, deafening in the close space. Bullets tore through pews, splinters flying like shrapnel. Kane dropped behind the altar, firing over its edge, yet shot, ringing with finality. A deputy screamed, clutching his throat. Another fell across the hymnals, his blood staining the pages. The cross loomed behind Kane, broken and burned, its shadow stretching over him like a curse and a shield both. Dillard shouted, "Pin him!" His deputies advanced, boots thundering down the aisle. Kane rose, eyes burning, and walked into their fire. His Colt barked again and again, each shot finding its mark. He moved like a storm himself, coat whipping, face set in stone. A bullet grazed his arm, burning hot, but he pressed forward, relentless. When the smoke cleared, only Dillard remained. He stood at the foot of the altar, pistol leveled, eyes sharp with rage, and something colder, fear. Candlelight flickered across his face, revealing the crack in his calm. "It ends here," Dillard hissed. Kane's badge glinted, as he stepped from behind the altar. "You're right. It does." The two men faced each other across the shadow of the fallen cross. Rain pounded the roof. Lightning painted their faces stark, black and white, as if heaven itself wanted the world to see. "You're a murderer hiding behind the law," Kane said, "but law don't save a man when justice comes callin'." Dillard's pistol wavered, just for a breath. He steadied it with a snarl. "Then let's see whose justice stands." Both men drew. The shots cracked in unison, deafening. Dillard staggered back, clutching his side, blood blooming across his coat. His pistol fell, clattering across the boards. He collapsed against a pew, gasping, his smile gone, replaced by the stark terror of a man who knew the truth had finally caught him. Kane lowered his Colt, smoke drifting from its barrel. His arm trembled, not from fear but from the weight of it all, the law, the badge, the cross, the eyes of the town that would hear of this night for generations. Dillard coughed blood, his voice rasping. "You think this ends with me? Governor won't forgive. They'll brand you outlaw, Kane. You'll hang." Kane stepped closer, his scar hard in the candlelight. "Maybe. But I'll hang clean, Marshal, and you'll rot with your lies." The Marshal slumped, eyes glazing, his hand slipping from his wound. His body stilled, and the storm outside seemed to pause with him. The sanctuary was silent, save for the hiss of rain against the roof and the low crackle of dying candles. The fallen cross loomed, its shadow now lying across Dillard's corpse. Kane holstered his Colt slow, his breath ragged. He glanced at the cross, then at the silver badge on his chest. For the first time, he couldn't tell which one weighed heavier. Behind him, the doors creaked. Eliza Merrick stepped inside, her shawl soaked, her face pale. She took in the scene, the blood, the bodies, the sheriff standing alone beneath the broken cross. Her voice was soft, trembling. "What have you done, Sheriff?" Kane didn't answer. He just turned his steel-gray eyes toward the storm, the scar on his jaw burning like fire, because he knew she was right. Tonight he hadn't saved the law. He had buried it. And outside, thunder rolled again, as if heaven itself was still not finished with him. Morning crept slow over Perdition Hollow, that pale light, pushing through the storm clouds that had raged all night. The rain had washed the streets clean, but not of blood. Smoke from smoldering candles still clung to the church rafters, mingling with the metallic tang of gunpowder and death. Sheriff Kane stood alone in the sanctuary, hat low, his duster heavy with water and ash. The broken cross still lay where it had fallen, shadows stretching across the floor like judgment itself. Dillard's body slumped beneath it, stiff and pale. The Marshal's polished badge glinted faintly on his chest, tarnished now with the dark bloom of blood. Kane's silver badge spun between his fingers. He stared at it as though it were the last coin of a gambler who'd lost everything. He'd killed many men under its weight, but this one was different. Dillard had been the governor's man. His death would not fade into dust. It would roar across the territory like thunder. The doors creaked open. Townsfolk trickled in cautiously, their faces pale, their steps hushed. Eliza Merrick stood among them, her shawl pulled tight, her papers clutched in one trembling hand. She had thought truth would be enough. Now truth lay sprawled beneath the broken cross, wearing the Marshal's badge. "Is it done?" she whispered, her voice trembling against the hollow air. Kane didn't look up. "It's done," But it ain't over. The Reverend stepped forward, Bible clutched like a shield. His voice wavered. You killed a Marshal of the United States. Whatever his sins, you've doomed yourself, Sheriff. Kane raised his steel-gray eyes. The scar along his jaw caught the morning light, stark and pale. I didn't kill a Marshal. I killed a murderer who wore a badge. You all saw what he was. You saw the proof. But the people shifted, uneasy. Some nodded, others looked away. The whispers began again, low and sharp. He's no better than Dillard. Law's dead in this town. Sheriff Kane's cursed. Kane holstered his Colt, the weight familiar but heavier than it had ever felt. He walked down the aisle slow, his boots echoing against the hollow floorboards. At the altar he paused, staring at the broken cross. He bent, picked it up, and set it back against the wall. It leaned crooked, scarred by fire, but it stood. Laws like this cross, Kane said, his voice rough, breaks easy, burns easy, but it still belongs upright, even if men like Dillard try to tear it down. The townsfolk watched, uncertain, torn between fear and hope. Eliza's voice rose, clear and trembling. You saved us, Sheriff. You gave John justice when no one else would. If they call you outlaw for that, then let them. You've done what no badge could. Her words stirred the room. Some faces softened, others hardened. The line between law and justice had split the town in two. From the doorway came the sound of hooves, riders approaching through the mud. A boy burst in, breathless, eyes wide. Soldiers, from the capital, they're riding hard. Must be 20 of 'em. Gasps spread. The Reverend crossed himself. Eliza's hands clutched her shawl tighter. Kane's jaw flexed. He stepped onto the porch as thunder rumbled once more over the hills. The riders came fast, banners whipping, rifles at their sides. At their head rode Colonel Avery, the governor's hand in the territory. His uniform gleamed even in the gray dawn, gold braid flashing like fire. The colonel reined up, mud splashing from his horse's hooves. His cold eyes fixed on Kane. Sheriff Kane, you stand accused of murdering Marshal Dillard in cold blood. Surrender your badge, your gun, and your freedom, or we will take them. The street fell silent, but for the creak of leather, the snort of horses, the hiss of rain still dripping from eaves. The whole town held its breath. Kane touched his badge, spinning it slow. He looked at Eliza, at the Reverend, at the faces of the people he'd bled for. He knew this was the crossroad, whether to die with the law's blessing or live with justice's curse. His voice carried steady as thunder. Marshal Dillard forged contracts, stole land, and killed men who stood in his way. Widow Merrick's husband among them. The proof's in her hands. The town saw it. They saw me stand against him. Colonel Avery sneered. Widow's papers mean nothing against a governor's seal. You murdered a federal marshal. That's all that matters. Kane's steel eyes hardened. Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me. The colonel raised his hand, signaling his men. Rifles lifted. Eliza cried out, holding the papers high. No, you'll bury the truth with him. This town saw it all. You'll be hanging justice itself if you take him. The crowd stirred, voices rising, angry now. Farmers, ranch hands, mothers with children, they surged forward, blocking the rifles with their own bodies. For the first time, the town stood not in whispers, but in open defiance. Colonel Avery hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He was a man of power, But even power bled when faced with too many witnesses. Slowly, his hand lowered. "This isn't over, Sheriff. The governor will want your head. One day, he'll have it." The soldiers wheeled their horses, their banners snapping as they rode back into the storm. Kane stood in the mud, the badge still heavy in his hand. He looked at it long, then closed his fist. The silver glinted one last time before he pinned it back to his chest. He turned to the town, his voice carrying across the rain-washed street. "You wanted law. You wanted justice. Truth is, you can't have both. But as long as I breathe, you'll have me." Some cheered, some turned away in silence. The line remained, but for now the town was his again. Kane walked back into the church, hat low, coat dripping, and stood before the crooked cross. His scar ached, his hand trembled faint, but his eyes burned steady. He whispered the words that marked every turning in his life. "Law ain't always justice, but justice rides with me." The cross loomed crooked behind him, the badge gleamed heavy on his chest, and the town of Perdition Hollow knew the reckoning was far from over. The storm had passed, but inside Sheriff Kane, the war raged on. He had killed Marshal Dillard beneath the sanctuary's broken cross, and in doing so had crossed a line no badge could mend. The governor's wrath would come. Kane knew it as sure as sunrise. Yet for all the weight of guilt pressing on his scarred soul, one truth burned steady. He had stood where law faltered, and he had not stepped aside. The people would whisper still, some calling him savior, others branding him executioner. But Kane no longer lived for whispers. He lived for the small mercies. A widow who could finally bury her husband without lies. A town that had seen the true face of power and chosen to speak against it. A crooked cross that still stood, scarred but upright, much like the man himself. As he rode out of Perdition Hollow that evening, the wind at his back, Kane felt the badge press heavy against his chest. Was it a shield or a shackle? He could not say. All he knew was that he would carry it, and justice with it, until his last ride.